He rejected me, publicly. For years, Rowan had been the perfect assistant, silently loving his boss, Adrian Vale, while enduring his control and subtle cruelty. But when Adrian humiliates him in front of the entire office, everything changes. That rejection sparks a fire, and Rowan begins to reclaim his worth, his confidence, and his life. Enter Elliot Graves, a man who sees him, respects him, and shows him what freedom feels like. From humiliation to empowerment, this is a story of resilience, love, and finally being truly valued. Don't forget to subscribe to Sweet Serenity. I had always believed that silence was a form of dignity. That if I carried my feelings carefully enough, neatly folded between emails, calendar reminders, and late-night revisions, they would never spill. For 3 years, I had perfected the art of being invisible in plain sight. I was the assistant who arrived before everyone else, who knew my boss's coffee order without asking, who anticipated his needs before he spoke them aloud. Loving him felt like part of the job description, something unspoken yet understood. Like breathing in an office that never truly slept. His name was Adrian Vale, and he was everything the corporate world admired: polished, commanding, devastatingly composed. The kind of man whose presence shifted a room without effort. I told myself I admired him only professionally. I repeated it so often that it almost became true. Almost, but admiration has a way of deepening when you're the one standing closest to the fire, absorbing its warmth and its burn. Every late night, every quiet elevator ride, every brief smile he reserved only for me chipped away at the walls I had built. The morning it happened began like any other. The office buzzed with the low hum of printers and muted conversations, glass walls reflecting ambition and fatigue in equal measure. I had finalized the quarterly report at dawn and triple-checked his schedule, my hands steady even as my chest tightened with something that felt like inevitability. There was a company-wide meeting scheduled for noon, an unexpected one. Adrian had asked me to stay close. "I'll need you there," he'd said, his voice neutral, his eyes unreadable. I took that as a sign. I always did. By noon, the entire office had gathered. Assistants, executives, interns, everyone packed into the open meeting hall. I stood a step behind Adrian, tablet in hand, my posture professional, my heart betraying me with its reckless hope. He cleared his throat and began to speak about restructuring, about growth, about the future. Words floated past me, meaningless, because all I could think about was how heavy my chest felt, how tired I was of carrying something alone. I don't know what possessed me, courage, exhaustion, or the quiet belief that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't wrong all along. When he paused to take a question, I stepped forward. The room went still. I felt every eye turned toward me, curiosity flickering into interest. My voice didn't shake when I spoke, which surprised me. I kept it soft, respectful, careful. "Adrian, I just wanted to say something. Not as your assistant, but as myself." The silence stretched. My heart pounded so loudly I was certain others could hear it. What I hadn't anticipated was his reaction. He laughed, not loudly, worse. A short, disbelieving sound that sliced through me. He turned fully toward me then, his expression hardening into something cold and distant. "This is not appropriate," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the room. "I don't know what gave you the impression that I would ever be interested in you beyond your role here." A murmur rippled through the crowd. I felt it like a physical blow. My face burned. But he wasn't done. "Let me be clear," he continued, louder now. "I value professionalism. Anything else is unfortunate." The word echoed in my head. Unfortunate, as if my feelings were a minor inconvenience, a mistake to be corrected. Laughter followed, nervous, awkward, cruel in its hesitation. I wanted the floor to open up and swallow me whole. Instead, I stood there, nodding once, as if accepting feedback. The meeting ended shortly after. People avoided my gaze as they filed out, whispers trailing behind them like shadows. Someone patted my arm in passing, sympathy thinly veiled as pity. I returned to my desk and sat there, hands folded, breathing shallowly. I didn't cry. Not then. I had spent years mastering control. I wasn't about to lose it in front of witnesses. Adrian didn't look back at me once. By the end of the day, my inbox was full of work requests, as if nothing had happened. As if I hadn't been reduced to a lesson in boundaries. I completed every task, my fingers moving on muscle memory alone. When the office lights dimmed and people began to leave, I remained seated, staring at the reflection of myself in the darkened screen. I looked the same, but something inside me had cracked open, irrevocably. I didn't know it yet, but that moment, the public rejection, the laughter, the silence that followed, was not the end of my story. It was the moment everything began to shift. Adrian believed he had drawn a line, that he had put me back in my place. What he didn't understand was this: once something breaks in full view of others, it can never be hidden again, and I was done being invisible. The morning after the rejection, the office felt louder than usual. Not because people spoke more, but because every silence had weight. I could feel it pressing against my skin as I walked in, glances that lingered a second too long, smiles that came too quickly, sympathy disguised as professionalism. Wordlessly, the entire office had agreed on one thing: I was now a cautionary tale. I arrived earlier than I ever had, hoping the emptiness would steady me. It didn't. My desk was exactly as I'd left it, neat and controlled, a mirror of the life I had tried to maintain. I powered on my computer and stared at my inbox, pretending the emails mattered more than the memory replaying in my head. Adrian's laugh, his voice, the way he hadn't lowered it. I wondered, briefly, if he had known how deeply his words would cut, or if he simply hadn't cared. By the time Adrian arrived, I had already organized his entire day. Old habits died hard. He walked past my desk without looking at me, the scent of his cologne trailing behind him like a ghost. No apology, no acknowledgement. It was as if the previous day had been erased for him, neatly filed under resolved issues. For me, it was still bleeding. Mid-morning, he called me into his office. The glass walls felt like an accusation as I stepped inside. He didn't invite me to sit. He spoke while scrolling through his tablet, his tone businesslike, efficient. "I trust there won't be a repeat of yesterday," he said. Not a question, a warning. I nodded, my throat tight, and murmured agreement. He finally looked up then, his eyes scanning me as if assessing damage. "Good," he said. "We'll keep things professional." Professional. The word tasted bitter. It had always been professional on paper. What he didn't know was how many times I had stayed late just to make his life easier, how many personal sacrifices had disguised as dedication. I left his office with my head high, but something inside me had shifted. For the first time, I began to see him not as the man I love, but as the man who had chosen reputation over honesty. The rest of the day passed in fragments, meetings blurred together. Conversations floated past me without landing. During lunch, I ate alone at my desk, scrolling mindlessly through job postings I had never allowed myself to consider before. Assistant roles, executive support, a different company, a different life. The idea felt disloyal and thrilling. I closed the tab quickly, guilt flaring, then paused. What loyalty had earned me this? That evening, as most of the office emptied out, I received an email marked urgent. A client meeting had been rescheduled to the following week, requiring coordination with another firm. The sender's name caught my attention: Elliot Graves, Senior Operations Director. I'd heard of him: calm, precise, respected. I responded promptly, my message concise and neutral. His reply came minutes later, courteous and unexpectedly warm. "Thank you for your efficiency," he wrote. "It's refreshing." The compliment lingered with me longer than it should have. It wasn't flirtation, it wasn't loaded. It was simply acknowledgement, something I hadn't realized I'd been starved of. Over the next few days, our correspondence continued. Scheduling, logistics, small clarifications. Each exchange was professional, yet I found myself breathing easier after every reply. Elliot never assumed, never dismissed. He listened even through email. Adrian noticed the change before I did. He began asking where I was going after work, why certain reports were delayed by minutes instead of seconds. His tone sharpened, irritation creeping in where indifference had once lived. It confused me. He had drawn the line, hadn't he? Why did it matter if I stepped closer to another one? The question sat heavy in my chest, unanswered. One afternoon, as I prepared documents for the upcoming joint meeting, Adrian stopped by my desk. "You've been distracted," he said. I looked up, meeting his gaze steadily. "I've been working," I replied. The smallest flicker of surprise crossed his face. It felt like a victory, however minor. He lingered for a moment, as if searching for something to say, then walked away without another word. The night before the meeting, I stayed late again, but this time, it wasn't for him. I reviewed notes, organized files, and prepared myself to step into a room where I would be seen not as someone's assistant, but as a professional in my own right. As I shut down my computer, I caught my reflection in the dark screen. I looked tired. That there was something else there to resolve, sharp and unfamiliar. I didn't know what Elliot Graves would be like in person. I didn't know how the meeting would unfold, or why the thought of it made my pulse quicken. All I knew was that something had shifted irrevocably the moment Adrian chose to reject me publicly. He believed he had ended something inconvenient. What he hadn't realized was that he had given me permission to look elsewhere, to imagine a future where my worth wasn't something to be laughed at. And somewhere beyond the glass walls of that office, beyond the role I had clung to for too long, a different story was quietly beginning to take shape. I arrived at the office that morning with a strange mix of anticipation and dread. The air smelled faintly of coffee and paper, but beneath that ordinary scent lingered the weight of the upcoming meeting. Today was not just another corporate gathering. Today, Adrian Vale would truly see me in front of clients, executives, and, most importantly, someone who didn't treat me like I was invisible. I had prepared meticulously. Every report polished, every document ordered, every contingency planned. My hands, once trembling with silent longing, now moved with quiet precision. There was no room for hesitation. I refused to let him or anyone diminish me again. Yet, despite my determination, my chest tightened every time Adrian walked past my desk, his presence still a gravitational pull I could neither ignore nor confront. By mid-morning, the meeting room was filling. The long, polished table reflected the gleam of ambition and power. Adrian arrived last, as always, radiating control. His sharp suit and sharper smile masked the slightest crack in his armor, one I had begun to notice after the rejection. He glanced at me, eyes narrowing briefly, curiosity, anger. I couldn't tell. I only knew I would no longer be afraid of the look. Then he arrived, Elliot Graves, calm, composed, commanding without demanding. When our eyes met, I felt a strange sense of grounding I hadn't known I needed. Elliot didn't glance at Adrian first, didn't acknowledge the hierarchy in the room. He only looked at me, and in that brief, steady gaze, I realized something crucial. This meeting was no longer about Adrian's power. It was about mine. The meeting began. Discussions, negotiations, strategy, all the usual corporate maneuvers. But as we moved through each agenda item, I found my voice, my confidence growing with every word. Adrian's interjections, once cutting and dominant, now met resistance, not rude, not emotional, just firm, professional. I was no longer trembling in the shadow of his authority. For the first time, I was standing on my own. Halfway through the discussion, Elliot asked a question directly to me. "What's your assessment of the implementation timeline?" His tone was neutral, expectant. I paused, then spoke with clarity and precision, weighing out a plan that balanced ambition with feasibility. Heads turned, Adrian's jaw tightened. The room's energy shifted subtly. People began to look at me differently. I could see the realization flicker in their eyes. I was more than an assistant, I was a professional. When the meeting adjourned, Elliot lingered. "Your analysis was impressive," he said quietly, not as a compliment to soothe, but as acknowledgement of skill. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, but this time it wasn't shame, it was pride. Adrian, however, remained silent. His expression was carefully neutral, but I could see it: frustration, disbelief, a flicker of jealousy that he had never permitted himself to feel before. Later, as I gathered my things, Adrian approached me, cornering me near the office elevator. "You've changed," he said, voice low, controlled. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but this isn't you. You're crossing lines." I met his gaze steadily. "No, Adrian, this is exactly me. For the first time, I'm not shrinking for anyone." His lips tightened. The subtle charm that had once disarmed me now felt hollow. He had lost his hold. I could see it, even as he tried to mask it. Stepping out of the elevator, I felt the weight of months, years, lift slightly. It wasn't complete freedom, not yet, but the first crack had appeared. That afternoon, Elliot invited me for coffee outside the office, a casual meeting, he said. That as we sat across from each other, sharing thoughts on work and life, I realized how rare it was to feel truly seen, appreciated, unmeasured against some impossible standard of adoration or control. By the time I returned to the office, Adrian had left. In the empty hall, I paused and let myself exhale. The humiliation, the silent longing, the laughter that had once cut so deeply it was fading. I was no longer the assistant who hid behind spreadsheets and loyalty. I was someone who had claimed a piece of himself back, and he had nothing left to take. That night, as the city lights flickered outside the office windows, I understood something essential. Adrian Vale had rejected me publicly, but it was his own downfall. The world hadn't ended, my heart hadn't shattered irreparably. In fact, it had begun to open to possibilities I hadn't allowed myself to see. And somewhere in the quiet, steady presence of Elliot Graves, I felt the first real taste of what it meant to be seen, valued, and most importantly free. The next morning, the office felt different. Not in any physical sense, but in the quiet hum of energy that no longer pressed on my shoulders. I arrived early, as usual, but I didn't feel the old familiar knot of anxiety tighten in my chest when Adrian walked past. He was there, seated at his corner office, eyes flicking in my direction. But for the first time, I didn't flinch. I didn't shrink, I simply moved forward, carrying the weight of my own worth like a shield he no longer held the key to. Today's agenda had me coordinating a high-stakes project with Elliot. Our meetings were precise, professional, but beneath the surface, there was a warmth, a trust that I hadn't realized I'd been missing for years. When he looked at me, it wasn't as if he owned a piece of me or controlled my narrative. He simply acknowledged me. The difference was monumental. Each interaction reminded me that my value was inherent, not granted by someone else's approval. Adrian eventually approached my desk, his expression a careful mix of irritation and disbelief. "I need to speak with you," he said. Tone clipped, I looked up, meeting his gaze calmly. "I think we've said everything we need to say," I reply. He blinked, almost uncomprehending. "You don't understand," he started, but I held up my hand. "No, Adrian. I understand perfectly. You rejected me publicly, and I survived. You tried to control me, and I reclaimed myself. There's nothing more for you to say." He froze, eyes narrowing. For the first time, I saw him truly unsettled, stripped of the effortless control he had always wielded. My words were not angry, not vindictive, they were steady and final. And that, more than anything, was what left him powerless. In that moment, I realized how much time I had wasted measuring my worth against someone incapable of seeing it. By the afternoon, the project with Elliot progressed smoothly. He suggested a celebratory dinner at a nearby restaurant, casual, professional, but I sensed the subtle intention behind it, a chance to acknowledge what had shifted, to mark the beginning of something new. I accepted, not out of impulse, but because I wanted to step fully into the life I was reclaiming. That evening, sitting across from him, I felt the calm I had never experienced with Adrian. Elliot didn't demand my admiration, he didn't test my loyalty. He simply asked, listened, and respected. Each word exchanged, each shared laugh, was a quiet affirmation. I was seen, I was valued, I was free. The contrast was staggering. The man who had controlled me for years would never have this. He would never feel this quiet certainty of mutual respect and genuine care. When I returned to the office the following day, Adrian had left early. No meetings scheduled, no words of instruction. Rumors swirled subtly through the office. The assistant who had been humiliated publicly had risen in quiet competence, and the boss who had wielded rejection as a weapon now faced his own impotence. I walked past colleagues' desks with a light step, the knowledge of my regained dignity warming each movement. It wasn't instant euphoria. I still felt echoes of past humiliation. Moments when the memory of that public laughter pricked at my confidence. But now, I met those memories with a kind of clarity. They belonged to the past. They had shaped me, yes, but they no longer defined me. I could breathe, I could smile, I could plan not for approval, but for myself. Weeks passed, the bond with Elliot grew naturally, effortlessly. He never pushed, never demanded, never tried to control. His respect for my autonomy was the greatest affirmation of all. We spent late nights refining projects, celebrating wins, sharing meals, exchanging thoughts. The work that had once been suffocating under Adrian's dominance now became a canvas where I could thrive. I felt alive in ways I hadn't dared hope for. And then came the moment of undeniable closure. Adrian walked by my desk again, his presence sharp as ever, but this time there was no weight behind it, no threat of control. Our eyes met briefly. I offered a polite nod. He stiffened, words unspoken, before moving on. He had lost, entirely, completely. No words, no apologies, no regrets on my side, just the quiet truth that his power over me had ended, and nothing could revive it. That evening, Elliot and I walked together along the quiet streets, city lights casting reflections in puddles from a brief rain. He handed me a single white rose, simple, unadorned, but it carried more meaning than any grand gesture could. "For the beginning," he said softly. I smiled, feeling a rush of emotion that had nothing to do with fear, nothing to do with possession. It was freedom, it was choice, it was love. I realized then, fully, completely, I had survived humiliation, I had reclaimed myself, and I had chosen someone who saw me not as a tool, not as a possession, but as a partner. Adrian's rejection had been a cruel catalyst, but it had led me here, to this moment, to a life where I was not just visible, but celebrated. And as I held that rose, warmth blossoming in my chest, I finally understood the most important truth of all. I was free, I was loved, and I would never let anyone take that away again.